When a grain of dust of the times, into a MiG-23, falling on their heads, what kind of feeling? A civilian boy in Belgium suffered a bizarre air crash. This crashed MiG-23 actually or unmanned, a breath in the enemy territory flew more than 900 kilometers, as in no man's land, came to launch an attack. The history of Soviet aviation is full of strange and outrageous. But like this one today, it can definitely be counted as the most outrageous. Early in the morning of July 4, 1989, Colonel Nikolai Skuridin, a first-class pilot in the Soviet Air Force, was preparing to take off in a MiG-23B, stationed at Belgium Air Base in Poland. On a simple mission intended to perform interception training over the Baltic Sea, with his MiG-23's fuel tanks filled, though armed only with 200 rounds of 23mm ammunition. Colonel Skuridin was experienced, with 1,700 hours of flying experience, and approached this training how it looked like a routine and simple flight for him. However, what happened next was far from routine. Skuridin put the aircraft's flaps to 18.5 degrees, pushed full throttle and started to sprint on runway 23. The Timansky R-29-300 turbojet engine roared up and propelled the fighter to takeoff speed and then left the runway for a smooth liftoff. But just 41 seconds after leaving the ground, Skuridin just retracted the landing gear and found that the pressurized combustion chamber was always flimsy and weak. Comrade Colonel cried out that something was wrong, and from the rear view mirror in the cabin, he saw a long smoke trailing behind the aircraft's engine, which was an early sign of engine failure, and at this time the altitude was only 130 to 150 meters above the ground, and because it was in a state of climb, the speed also plummeted from 502 kilometers per hour to 338 km/h. Without speed, the plane began to drop altitude and the risk of crashing was high. Skuridin, who was in a cold sweat, quickly began to try to reopen the acceleration, but to no avail. He urgently reported to the ground command center that due to engine failure, the current situation was completely impossible for the aircraft to turn around and land on the ground. After obtaining the consent of the ground command center, Skuridin turned the nose of the aircraft to the direction of the Baltic Sea and then quickly pulled the ejection jump handle and successfully ejected from the cockpit a few seconds later. But as Comrade Colonel hung under his parachute, his heart began to grow apprehensive, for he neither saw any crashed aircraft around him nor heard the sound of an explosion. It was only after the ground troops who came to search and rescue found him that he learned the shocking news that after he ejected from the cabin, the MiG-23, as if it suddenly had a mind of its own, adjusted its own flight status and, unmanned, actually automatically pulled up in altitude while deflecting to the left and heading southwest. This scared the tower commander. The southwest direction is not ordinary. The Cold War, the Warsaw Pact and NATO in this area have a heavy concentration of troops. The slightest carelessness will be gunfire, and this unmanned MiG-23 seems to have no intention of falling down. The Soviet military urgently dispatched several fighters to intercept the MiG-23, but the Polish airbase at Belgium was too close to East Germany, and the lone MiG-23 soon flew out of the Polish border and immediately over the GDR. Before Soviet fighters arrived, the MiG-23 flew into the airspace of the Federal Republic of Germany. At 9:40 a.m., the NATO radar station in West Germany's Lower Saxony was the first to spot the invading aircraft, but for a time NATO commanders were confused. If the Soviet invasion, naturally it should first be a massive missile attack, followed by a deluge of fighters, bombers, and tanks and armor to cover the sky, so a wobbly fighter jet flying to count what? If this is the attack from the Malbert, this is too weak, but if it is a defection, it is not necessary to fly so slow. A few minutes after the radar found the lone MiG-23, two F-15s stationed at Soesterberg Air Base in the Netherlands took off urgently. They belonged to the 32nd Tactical Fighter Squadron of the U.S. Air Force in Europe. Today, July 4th, is the U.S. Independence Day. The base is preparing to open the party. Everyone looked at the two F-15s that took off in admiration. I did not expect the base leadership also thoughtfully arranged a flight show. The two F-15s, flown by J.D. Martin and Bill Murphy respectively, were excited to face their first live battle, but then realized that their biggest enemy was not the opposite aircraft, but from their own people. Due to coordination problems, at least 3 GCI ground control intercept units thought they should be in charge of commanding the formation flight. But the communications between these three were not in communication with each other, and all at once Martin and Murphy's headsets began to transmit uninterrupted command orders from various people, and these people were even more excited than both of them. Due to the noisy orders, the two F-15s remained in the air for a considerable time before they figured out the actual location and heading of the target. They quickly accelerated to supersonic speed to the northeast at an altitude of 10,000 meters and soon locked on to the intruding aircraft at 30 kilometers. But the aircraft was simply too calm in the face of the fire control radar. It remained at 10,000 meters, unperturbed and unmoved, still going its own way. The orders in the headset were again noisy, some saying east and some saying west, until Captain Martin really had enough and yelled into the radio that he was only communicating with the Dutch Ground Control Interception Command Center and that all other GCI units should shut up. The communication interference in the headset only then subsided for a while. The F-15 formation, slowly approaching the target from the rear, reached a distance of 4 kilometers when Martin identified it as a MiG-23 and reported it to the command center, and soon a variety of different tones of "please repeat" queries came through the headset. Only after Martin repeated the question a dozen times did the gang on the ground believe him and ordered the F-15 formation to lead it to the nearby German air base at La Bruque for landing. The two men began to approach the target further, with Wingman Murphy taking up the rear surveillance and Long Plane Martin flying over to intercept. As they got closer and closer, they heard Martin report over the radio, "Houston, we've got a problem here.
No pilot, the canopy is missing. The plane is flying autonomous."
The F-15 in the air finally got a good look at the MiG-23, which was more of a mystery than a threat. No missiles, no pilot, no cockpit cover, not even a seat, flying unmanned like a ghost on autopilot at over 300 kilometers per hour. What the hell is this thing up to? It was 10:02. Hearing this message, the headset came countless times, "Please repeat." Martin can only repeat again a dozen times, and then the command center fell into a long silence. Do not have to ask, also want to get. The gang began to frantically go through the combat manual to see what to do in the end encounter this situation. Finally, the command center, which had been torn for a long time, sent an order for the F-15 formation to follow and monitor this MiG-23 first, and then shoot it down after it flew over the North Sea so as not to hurt the flowers and plants on the ground. At first contact, the MiG-23 was flying at 10,000 meters, but had been in a slow climb and stopped climbing at 11,000 meters as it was approaching the upper limit of engine operation. Soon, Martin and Murphy saw smoke starting to billow from the back of this aircraft, and it was clear that this one had run out of gas and began to slowly drop in altitude and turn to the left. It was now impossible to expect this MiG-23 to fly to the North Sea. Its flight turned towards France and it would surely crash somewhere up ahead, and fast. Hearing that unmanned fighters were flying towards them, the French panicked a bit and immediately sent Mirage 2000 fighters up to meet them. At this point the F-15 formation was given permission to fire, but only if it was determined that an aerial hit would cause less damage to the ground than if it were allowed to fall on its own. This is not an instruction, but a clear indication that the two of them will take the blame for the consequences of the crash. The two men cursed their mothers while following the MiG-23 down to an altitude of 4,000 meters, when Martin and Murphy finally came to the conclusion that the plane would eventually crash land near the French city of Lille, and that if they watched the plane head for the city, they would shoot it down on the outskirts of the city, and if it didn't make it to the city, they would let it crash in the sparsely populated outskirts of the city. It was a good plan, in for the attack and out for the defense. But it was just that no one expected that the world's unluckiest man was about to make his appearance. As the altitude got lower and lower, the F-15 formation was basically sure that the MiG-23 would crash on the outskirts of the city. But too low an altitude would result in a loss of radio contact, so Murphy flew his wingman to stay at high altitude to act as a radio relay while Martin flew his long plane to continue to drop altitude to monitor the MiG-23. At 10:37 a.m., the MiG, which had flown unmanned for 900 kilometers, was getting lower and lower in altitude, and it used a perfect pull-up landing attitude to cross the road and crash into the house of the Della family near Kortrijk, Belgium, where the 19-year-old had just gotten high all night with friends to celebrate the end of his university exams and was snoozing inside when the plane crashed over. At this point, just over an hour had passed since Skilliken's ejection jump. With no fuel, the impact did not cause much fire and the F-15 circled over the site for 10 to 15 minutes before returning to base. Because the aircraft was not notified, the Belgian government immediately lodged a formal protest with the Soviet Union. Belgian Foreign Minister Mark Eskens said that, from the time the MiG-23 was first detected by NATO radar until it crashed an hour later, the Soviets did not give any warning and were slow to clarify afterwards whether the jet was carrying nuclear or toxic weapons. The first official report from the Soviet Union was issued only 12 hours after the accident. A day later, Gorbachev, who was on a state visit to Paris, sent his condolences to Belgium. After learning that his MiG-23 had smashed a man to death, Colonel Skilliken also issued a public apology, saying, "If I could have foreseen that this plane would have such tragic consequences, I would have stayed on board until the end." In November 1989, the Soviet Union paid the equivalent of 625,000 euros in compensation to Belgium. Most of it went to Della's family. After the Soviet Union recovered the wreckage, and after careful examination by experts, it turned out that the MiG-23 had undergone 5 major overhauls, and the multiple disassemblies damaged the aircraft's internal fuel lines, causing Skilliken to be unable to open the pressurized burners and increase its flight speed. When Skillikin ejected and parachuted out, the tremendous impact restored the point of failure in the fuel line, which allowed the aircraft to regain power. And with fewer pilots and heavy ejection seats, the MiG suddenly lost more than 200 kilograms of weight in front of it, shifted its center of gravity toward the tail, began to tilt its nose slightly upward, put on its flaps, and began to climb firmly into flight at a takeoff speed of 170 knots, regaining its life. After the incident, Stump, a Defense Department spokesman in Washington, D.C., asked what had happened to the Soviet pilot, replied that it was unclear and could only assume that the plane was not unmanned and had taken off on its own. "See, what is called professional, this is called professional," said really dripping with water. Thank you for seeing the end. If you like this video, remember to leave a like before you go. With your support, we can see you next time.